Rome, St. Peter's Square. It's not called going on pilgrimage nowadays, but that's what it is. History, religion, art, whatever brings them, they come to relive some of the great moments of the human spirit. One of them was 5 centuries ago, a moment of crowning vision we call the High Renaissance, when Pope Julius II brought 2 artists to Rome to paint certain rooms in the Papal Palace of the Vatican. One of them was Michelangelo, who was in his early 30s. The other was still only in his 20s, and he was to become, quite simply, the most profoundly influential, the most idolized, the most beloved painter in the whole history of art. Raphael's The School of Athens, as it's come to be called. Actually, Raphael never gave it a name. In some ways, it's so familiar, it's hard to see it as it would once have been seen. 5 centuries is a long time for patterns of culture to change. Raphael's contemporaries would have known at once who all these people were. We have to be told.
Aristoteles and wrote as Plato.
But you can still catch the sense of occasion here, feel the enthusiasm of people involved in matters of high moment.
Towards me, please. Otherwise, I might have to yell across all these people. This is Raphael's School of Athens.
And just occasionally, we can join in that original excitement of putting names to faces among all that host of characters, men we would have known by sight.
Plato is, in fact, modeled on Leonardo da Vinci, whereas Michelangelo is here in the foreground writing. Raphael himself is over there in a black cap, rather modestly to one side.
Raphael at 27, telling his audience that the age they lived in could match the greatest that history had ever known. What exhilarating confidence to have. Christ in glory above another great assembly of figures, another celebration of human endeavor and the splendor of an age, this time in the service of God. And in this room, which was once the library of a Renaissance pope, the muse of poetry presiding over the kingdom of art. Not far away in the Vatican are gallery upon gallery of Greco-Roman statues. They'd have recognized the references to this world too in Raphael's time, a world which to us seems rather distant and cold. But to the Renaissance it was an inspiration, a rediscovered heritage of what man had achieved once and could achieve again. For passing on that vision of greatness to the centuries that followed, Raphael became a culture hero, an ideal, art's most popular patron saint. It's not always easy to live as we do with the continuing echoes of that canonization. Yet this is Raphael's earliest biographer writing within the memory of those who knew him. All who worked with Raphael lived united and in harmony. They forgot every ill humor when they saw him, every low or mean thought deserted their minds. Such a thing was never seen before. He was so full of gentleness and love that even animals loved him, not to speak of men. Those who possess such gifts as he did are surely not mere mortals, but rather mortal gods. We are dealing not just with an artist, but with a legend. Nothing in art or life is quite so uplifting as to let the eye travel into some vast space. Space for a man to stretch in and feel the measure of himself. Space as an enlargement of the spirit. In the art of Raphael, space sets the stage for everything else he has to say. He was born in 1483, and he came from and spent all his formative years surrounded by a countryside he was quite evidently in love with all his life. Not a dramatic one, but spacious, easeful, lived in and yet timeless. The landscape of central Italy among the foothills of the Apennines. Is a landscape which appears again and again in his paintings, filled with that love of nature and love of light which had begun to suffuse the whole Renaissance awareness of the physical world. Landscapes closely observed, but at the same time extensions of mood and memory and feeling. Raphael locates his ideal world somewhere precisely between the countryside he knew and the plains of heaven. But in the 15th century, this was all disputed territory. Raphael's forebears had been burnt out of their homes and forced to take refuge in the city. His grandfather was the first of them to settle in Urbino, a little hilltop town then of no great importance in the world. By the time Raphael was born there, it had been transformed. Under one of the most enlightened regimes in all Italy, crowned by one of the most gracious of all Renaissance palaces, Urbino had become a name of pride and wonder. Around the court of honor, the Duke's titles are inscribed in foot-high letters. What is the most necessary attribute of a great ruler, he was asked. Essere umano, he replied, to be humane. The man who created this building was Federico di Montefeltro, made Duke of Urbino by the Pope and seen here with his son Guidobaldo in a portrait which still hangs in the Ducal Palace. He was one of those spectacular Renaissance all-rounders who combined a life of action with the earnest pursuit of culture and scholarship. A brilliant general, a wise and benevolent ruler, he made Urbino a power in the land and earned such an international reputation that the King of England conferred on him the Order of the Garter. His son, aged 11 when Raphael was born, inherited the other aspect of the Urbino court. Federico's library was more distinguished even than the Pope's. He commissioned some of the earliest translations from the Greek. He employed a Flemish artist, Justus of Ghent, to paint these portraits of the learned men of antiquity to decorate his private study. That tiny, astonishing room, crammed with all the interests of his versatile life, and all depicted solely in patterns of inlaid wood. He encouraged music, sent envoys far and wide in search of manuscripts, was interested in clocks and scientific instruments. The Duke was ever careful, says his court historian, to learn some new thing every day. The court of Urbino laid the foundations for a new ideal of classical humanism. Here it attends a lecture by one of its resident scholars, and Raphael himself would help to bring its ideals to fruition in the days of Federico's son. But this portrait of Federico's Duchess was painted by one of the founders of that new vision. He painted also the great Duke himself. He was Piero della Francesca. Piero wrote a treatise on the art of perspective and dedicated it to Duke Federico. This painting may not be from his hand, it is certainly from his mind. An ideal city such as the Renaissance loved to dream of, a space of perfect reason, order, and mathematical proportion. It too was painted for the palace in Urbino, and there the young Raphael must unquestionably have known it, along with other paintings by Piero, like that mysterious masterpiece of silence and timelessness, the Flagellation of Christ. How long Piero was in Urbino, we don't know. He had probably retired from painting altogether by the time Raphael was a boy. But his spirit so pervades the ducal palace, the patterns and proportions and light-filled clarity of it. The tradition says he must have had some part in its design. The Duke's private oratory is a Piero painting in marble. No religious conflict was implied or even considered in the fact that side by side with it, designed in exactly the same spirit, was a temple to the Muses. That was the essence of humanism. The homage it paid to art and to life's less intellectual delights was equally devout. palace where Raphael's father, Giovanni Santi, was court painter to the Dukes of Urbino, the palace Raphael knew as a young boy. The year before he was born, Duke Federico had died and was buried in the nearby church of San Bernardino. But what Federico had created in Urbino, its art, its scholarship, its humane and civilized values, was the ambience the young Raphael grew up in. Familiar with, perhaps even trained in, the ways of a great Renaissance court, he was fortune's favorite from the start. Only a few streets away, below the palace, is the house where he was born, Raffaello Santi, on April 6, 1483. It's a surprisingly large house. His father, Giovanni, was clearly a man of substance. Beyond the private apartments on the other side of the courtyard is where he ran his studio, and where his son probably helped the team of assistants preparing canvases and grinding colours for the production of Giovanni's paintings. Poor Giovanni gets short shrift in the histories of art for being a dry and clumsy provincial. He doesn't really look that bad. And tradition claims it was not his son, but he, who painted the delicate Madonna and Child on the wall of his own house. It could just be the portrait of his young first wife, Maria, who died when their child was only 8. Giovanni himself died only 3 years later, in 1494. But he had left his son 3 gifts: a childhood familiar with the life of the studio, memories of that astonishing palace where his father worked, and records of a beautiful child, whether we believe they're really Raphael or not, in paintings in and around Urbino. We have no certain trace of the boy again till he's 17, except that he could look in the mirror and draw this. In the same decade that Columbus discovered a new world, Raphael set out from Urbino and crossed the mountains into Umbria. Ahead of him lay his real apprenticeship, and years when he would get used to travelling to and fro across an Italy ravaged by wars. Shortly before 1500, he was in the battle-mented city of Perugia. Perugia was a much more ancient town than Urbino, built by the Etruscans and with a university dating back to 1226. A steep hilltop town that became Raphael's second home and working base until he was at least 25. He went there to be apprenticed to a painter who takes his name from the city, Perugino, by many standards one of the most progressive in Italy. He'd studied perspective with Piero della Francesca. He'd been Leonardo da Vinci's fellow student in Florence, and Raphael's father had actually judged him Leonardo's equal. He still worked all over central Italy, but his studio, his art factory, was here in Perugia. In 1496, a decorative scheme for one of its main public buildings was commissioned from him by the city itself. Here in the Cambio, the central money exchange where merchants and bankers haggled over finance, Perugino masterminded a plan to be carried out with his assistants, a design to raise the moral tone of the place. On the end walls, a nativity and the transfiguration of Christ. These he painted himself. He dated the whole ensemble 1500 and signed it with his own self-portrait. Perugino at this time was aged around 50, tiring a little from overwork, beginning to repeat himself and trust a well-tried formula. But along the side wall, something new happened. One of the assistants breathing unexpected freshness into some of the figures, possibly using them to insinuate a portrait of himself. It could only be Raphael. The new hand appears again on the ceiling. Among the fanciful decorations, signs of the zodiac, perhaps Raphael's own invention. At 16 or 17 now, he was already so expert in his master's style that it fitted like a second skin. And from pupil to assistant, he was at the point of graduating now to junior partner, as it were, in the Perugino firm. He was revitalizing the Perugino style from within, bringing to it an extra touch of sensitivity, the alertness of youth. Raphael himself seems to have been remarkably like the gentle-featured saints he painted. Perugino invented the type, Raphael lived it. The two artists were so close they almost shared an identity. This is Perugino's St. Michael, the same dreamy remoteness, the rather sweet and delicate grace. At his best, a spiritual world away from the busy charm of most earlier Italian painting. No one in his time was quite so good as Perugino at knowing when and how to be simple, or feel the depth, colour and stillness of space in a painting, or conjure quietness out of the air. Raphael could not have known it yet, but Perugino mapped out half his future for him. In Città di Castello, a few miles from Perugia, he got a chance to work on his own. This is his first independent commission to survive complete, or more or less complete. It's something of a miracle it survives at all, for it's a banner for carrying in street processions to avert the plague. On one side, God creating Adam. Raphael is 19, possibly 20 by this time, and through the ruined paint you can glimpse the beginnings of a vision just that much larger than Perugino's. On the other side of the banner, two figures at the foot of a crucifixion. They are set in front of a far-reaching Umbrian landscape under a huge Umbrian sky. And again for Città di Castello, and against that same sky, a scene so clear and calm in the bright air that for the first time he signs his name to it, Rafael of Urbino. Already he is designing more subtly than his master, the figures grouped in depth, but each distinct and vivid and outlined in space. A crucifixion, but one not so much tragic as filled with youthful poetry and tremulous concern. He could absorb ideas now wherever he saw them. On a church front in Perugia, the joyous flutter of draperies blown by the wind to the sound of music, in carvings by Agostino di Duccio. An image from antique sculpture to catch that feeling of figures seen in the round and from every angle to be grafted on to the soulful gestures of Perugino. Young faces and bearded faces to vary the sameness of Perugino's expressions. The apostles ranged round a solidly three-dimensional tomb from which the Virgin Mary has ascended to be crowned Queen of Heaven among rejoicing angels. The coronation of the Virgin was for Perugia, a full-scale, two-tiered altarpiece crowded with figures, which is in fact less happy in its overall design than in its details. At its most spontaneous in the breeze-blown, music-making angels. They were studied first from life drawings in the workshop. But the altarpiece really begins to sing in the three little predella panels which ran along the base of the big painting. The space and grace of Perugino, for these are still basically Perugino designs, suddenly burst into flower like window boxes in bloom. On this miniature scale, Raphael reveals himself a born colorist. But the third one, the presentation in the temple, shows where he's preparing to go next. The temple architecture opens out from its center in a wide arc. The figures are not just grouped in a circle, they move through circular space. And like a vast wheel in space, whose front edge is humanity and whose far edge is too distant to be seen, the perspective of the Sposalizio revolves round an eye-catching circular temple rising at its center like the hub of the world. It's the form of the temple in Piero's ideal city, the form of Perugia's most ancient Christian church, the form of Bramante's Tempietto in modern Rome, the mystic circle of Renaissance mathematics and Renaissance symbolism, wedding mind and spirit like the ring presented to Mary in the marriage of the Virgin. Raphael was 21 and in every sense come of age. He signed his painting over the arch of the temple and dated it 1504. By the end of that same year, he had set his sights on new horizons. He travelled towards Tuscany, as artists had been doing for 2 centuries before him. He knew his apprenticeship was incomplete till he had studied at the very nerve centre of Renaissance art, Florence. This would be the focus of Raphael's life for the next 4 years. This was the city which had bred Giotto, Masaccio, Donatello and Brunelleschi, Fra Angelico, Ghiberti and Botticelli. When Raphael arrived there, Leonardo da Vinci was back in Florence. Working there again was the most talked of young sculptor in Italy, Michelangelo. The genius of Florence was for making ideas visible. They loved mathematics. They invented perspective. They had created a new architecture out of pure geometry. When they could see reason and order and harmony in things, they knew they were on the track of divine truths. Perfect form was godlike, and godlike too, because he set the standard for all form, was man. They had adopted that idea from the classical writings of Vitruvius. The uses of antiquity came naturally to a people who saw their city as the modern Athens. Donatello conceived his Annunciation with Greek architecture, Greek costumes, Greek figures. But its glory is that it's touchingly human. Florentine curiosity about human nature went hand in hand with a constant search for forms beautiful enough, heroic enough, ideal enough to express its infinite variety and eternal splendor. It's typical of Florence that Ghiberti's Doors of Paradise, the name Michelangelo gave them, are paintings expressed as sculpture. Florence always seized on the reality of things seen and felt in the round. It was that richness of experience they called vivacità and prontezza, life lived to the full. Even as painters, they thought like sculptors. Quite often, like Verrocchio, they were both. But here in the monastery of San Marco, you are at the heart of the other Florence, devout Christian Florence. This is the Great Crucifixion in the Chapter House by Fra Angelico. Fra Angelico was a Dominican, an order dedicated to the strict observance of orthodoxy. Perhaps only in a monastery could a certain double think within the Renaissance mind be honestly resolved. Perhaps only Fra Angelico wholly reconciled the claims of faith with the claims of Renaissance humanism. He painted in San Marco a series of small frescoes for meditation, one to each cell. One of his successors as prior of this monastery went out and for 3 extraordinary years made Florence face its own religious conscience. His name was Savonarola, and he so moved the people that they declared themselves Christ's own republic. In an ecstasy of godliness, they threw their worldly treasures, musical instruments, books of poetry, paintings, into a great bonfire of vanities. But the reaction was swift. Savonarola was burned as a heretic on the orders of an infuriated pope in 1498. That spiritual crisis had happened only 6 years before Raphael came to live in the city. Florence had recovered, it recovered from everything. It went back to its traditional preoccupation with making money. But men of the new generation had been shaken by Savonarola. He had prophesied calamities, they had suffered calamities. But he had also reawoken that national spirit of independence on which Florence so prided itself. Against all the odds, it was still a republic, still a free democracy. And it had commissioned a giant statue for the city to symbolize liberty defiant against its foes. Some people threw stones at it when it was first set up. Michelangelo's David has always been like that, tremendous but disturbing. One can't imagine Raphael liking it, but it was masterful in an idiom he had no experience of. He approached it with caution, got a model to adopt the same pose and drew that, just to study how it had been managed, that sense of negligent weight shift and dormant power. Very probably he was in the piazza the day the statue was unveiled on September the 8th, 1504. But the ringside seat he wanted was for an even bigger event, an approaching contest of giants. Michelangelo and Leonardo were engaged to paint battle scenes for the great council chamber of the city hall. Today the room is larger and smothered in battles by lesser and later men, for in the end the originals never got completed. We only know how Michelangelo designed his from what looks like a fairly accurate copy. He'd taken an incident from the wars with Pisa when Florentine soldiers had been caught off guard while bathing. Not so much a battle as a stunning excuse for a display of the nude body in action. A tour de force of that muscular energy Michelangelo was so supremely master of, and which Raphael was in Florence to learn. He couldn't absorb it straight away. Drama like that only surfaces in his work several years later. He did try a drawing or two of men fighting, but ideas were also coming at him from a rival direction, from Leonardo's battle scene, like the head of a man shouting. Leonardo had been at work in rooms set aside for him in the monastery of Santa Maria Novella. Again, only his studies survive. He had been in the service of Cesare Borgia. He had watched war at close hand. But his full-scale Battle of Anghiari we know only from reconstructions, this very fine one by Rubens. But this was only one side of Leonardo. There was another. After 4 years' work, he had just completed the Mona Lisa. And in that strange, still, silent portrait, Raphael found a pattern to work from. Not its mystery, that was beyond him, but the way a human presence looks out at you. He painted a group of portraits closely modelled on that pose, more factual, more realistic, but with the same guarded presence. Unfortunately, Maddalena Doni hadn't a shred of poetry about her, but more sympathetic was her husband. It's the same pose in reverse, the watchful, intelligent face, intelligently, watchfully observed. La Donna Gravida. One hand rests lightly on her pregnancy. We don't know who she is or what was Raphael's relationship to her, but for the work of a 23-year-old, it's felt already with a mature certainty and depth. Florentine art had seldom understood women as this youngster from Urbino seemed to do. The shadow of her necklace caresses the pale skin at her neck. She has no name. She is known simply as La Donna Muta, the lady who is silent. But her portrait hangs in the palace at Urbino, and it may be she was a member of the court there, as this girl too may have been. The unicorn in her lap was an emblem of Urbino, as it was also the time-honored attribute of virgins. This time Raphael catches the wide-eyed appeal of youth striving to look grown up. Clearly, Raphael has renewed his contacts with Urbino. Under the young Duke Guidobaldo, it was more than ever the pattern of all culture, intelligence, and grace. So much so that Castiglione chose it as the perfect setting for a famous book. Conversations about what constitutes the finest in human relationships. Virtues like restraint, consideration, sensitivity, good manners, and the nature of love. It was called The Courtier, and the conversations were imagined in these rooms. Castiglione was Raphael's close and lifelong friend, and everything we know Raphael to have been might have been modelled on that book. It comes out in a group of almost miniature designs done around this time, with a feeling about them of some poetic world of romance and chivalry. Raphael tests his pen on the edge of a scale drawing for one of them, pin pricked round the outlines for transfer to the painting. The knight is dreaming that on one side Venus offers him the choice of pleasure, beauty, love, some aspect of celestial virtue. This is Renaissance allegory, and it's sometimes hard to know. While on the other, Minerva offers wisdom, duty, or some different choice of virtue on his road through life. The knight is Scipione Borghese, scion of a noble house, and the allegory taken from Cicero, Scipio's dream. A matching panel of the three graces stands presumably for the rewards of his choice. They're Raphael's first classical nudes, adapted from an antique marble, but ripened into warm, adorable life. And then, to charm the Duchess of Urbino, another romance, a gentle climate of Perugia when Raphael worked there. It's hard to realize what violence plagued Italy in those turbulent years. Perugia was torn apart by it. The feuding of Shakespeare's Montagues and Capulets pales beside the horrors enacted on its streets by its own two ruling families, the Oddi and the Baglioni. Raphael had been 17 when one July night in 1500 a wedding feast ended in 4 murders. And next morning the instigator of the plot, Griffonetto Baglioni, was cornered in the street and cut to pieces. 6 years later, Griffonetto's mother, mourning her dead son, commissioned an altarpiece from Raphael. He designed it first as a lamentation of the Virgin, basing the composition and the style on Perugino. Then a motif from classical sculpture shifted his attention to the idea of the dead body being lifted instead of lying on the ground. It became an entombment of Christ. A scene of energetic action, the subject was now much more Florentine, with telling contrasts of character and emotion, instinct with drama and pathos. Emotion. Given a single figure, a saint, a woman particularly, like his Catherine of Alexandria, he brought to it all his innate gifts and new won skills. He expressed intensity of feeling, but his instinct was for emotional restraint. He understood grandeur, but he was most natural when he could be intimate. And there is one subject which brings together everything Raphael was and strove to become in his early 20s, a subject he made so much his own that his very name is now a byword for it. For a church in Perugia, he set out the direction of his thoughts. It's his first full-scale altarpiece on the theme of the Madonna and Child. The light and architecture of Urbino, the gentle piety of Umbria, the realism and sculptural clarity of Florence. To paint the Mother of God, you must go to the heart of one of the great mysteries of the faith. She is the bridge between two worlds, the human and the divine. Her child is a human infant and the Redeemer of mankind. Her destiny and his have been foretold from the beginning of time. She is at the turning point of history. Religious painting has to be so much more than good art. It has to be good religion also. The Madonna of Orcagna's great Florentine tabernacle is still as worshipful as an icon. Raphael's Madonnas would also be worshipful, but they would no longer be able to look back to that secure, centuries-old tradition of the sacred. They would need to go farther than Florentine art had gone already, towards an image that would border almost on the secular. Fra Angelico gave the outlines of humanism to a devotion innocent of doubt. But his child is like a miniature adult, clothed, upright, and conscious of divinity. The Della Robbia image is the essence of sweet naturalness, but the child still turns to bless. In the years of the Medici, years of luxury and art, Botticelli turned the whole theme to poetry. You did not kneel, you did not adore, you fell in love with a dream of beauty. That dream was shattered by Savonarola. Beauty was vanity. In Raphael's Florence, Botticelli lived in retirement and had given up painting. The young Raphael favors a less luxurious Madonna. No angels hover round her. There is no decoration. She is demure, reserved, and simple. Later, he expresses her differently, his conception changing along with changes in his style. But he relies on the same appeal. It is all very natural, very human, very affectionate. The children play, as solemnly as children do play, under the eye of a mother who is young and beautiful, for all Madonnas must be young and beautiful. He warmed to the beauty of women. Altogether, Raphael painted around 40 variations on the mother and child theme, almost half of them in these years before he was 25. His creative energy poured into them, images calling for all his observation of people and feeling for life, but needing the endless shaping and condensing and paring down of art. Naturalness and art, they worked together, for the art made the images Madonnas, but the naturalness gave them a human charm. Charm, of course, is fickle. In chubby babies and in young girls' looks, tastes can change. But when naturalness and art combine like this, the Raphael Madonna raises human sentiment to the status of popular icon. Leonardo had invented the idea of adding an infant John the Baptist to the mother and child group in his Virgin of the Rocks. Raphael never ceased learning from Leonardo and realized at once that he had made the subject exist much more sculpturally in depth. Leonardo's shadowy modeling was famous. Light and shade, he said, should blend like smoke sfumato. Blend the forms into the depth of space. Raphael had always known the value of setting his Madonnas in landscape. But more children in the composition meant more variety of grouping and gesture. The forms built naturally to that broad-based pyramid Leonardo specially advocated. Raphael had graduated from the half-length Madonna to the full-length seated Madonna with the child or children at her feet. But the introduction of John the Baptist had to be explained. Raphael would have preferred to do so without symbols. They cut across the naturalness he aimed at. He made even halos as insignificant as possible, and symbols of foreboding like the cross he introduced as though they might be toys for rather knowing children. The goldfinch, too, foretells the sacrifice of Christ. But how do you show a human child's divine awareness without making him look arch? There'd been this problem from the very earliest of his Madonnas. She reads the future in the Book of the Prophets. It was a convention, but it was beginning to look old-fashioned. Raphael tried to concentrate on more convincing family relationships, even when the symbolism stayed. Michelangelo, at this same time, approached the problem through action. His Madonna is nobler, more ideal, but the child recoils from the goldfinch as if struggling to escape. Raphael tried out that motivation, the child shrinking back in fear, the mother protective, comforting, the Baptist's mother, St. Elizabeth, watching with concern, but not yet with understanding. But for Raphael, it was drama of the wrong kind, too external. This sculpture from late antiquity is a possible clue to how he changed it and why. His final painting is a Holy Family. The whole mood and motive is altered. The goldfinch has gone. Christ and the Baptist meet without fear, but Elizabeth turns up to Joseph with a sudden cry of premonition. Michelangelo's Holy Family was harder to follow. Raphael hadn't yet an instinct for the heroic, but he recognized a nobler rhythm than his own in that slow turn and lift of the arms, that circling in space of heads and limbs. He drew the head of Michelangelo's Christ child, and in his own experiments with closed form and encircling movement, arrived eventually at a new design for a Madonna. It was in a more developed style, the gesture larger and more ample. What this Madonna might lose in sweetness, she would gain in grandeur.